what does the phrase brother of the Lord even mean? Is the grammar of Galatians 1:19 painfully explicit about what Paul is trying to convey? Dr. Kipp Davis makes a big deal about knowing the languages of the biblical authors. I agree that this would be a big deal to cover and go over and formulate counter arguments to if anybody in this conversation was making a novel argument about the Greek contained in Galatians. Dr. Carrier does his own analysis of the Greek, but he is also an expert in this area. But as for me, I just simply read what the scholarship says about the Greek. Therefore, I don't have to know the Greek in order to understand the arguments for certain positions. And most importantly, I come to my own conclusions on these topics. Dr. Kipp Davis seems to be attempting to gatekeep this discussion so that only scholars that he personally endorses and agrees with can have meaningful input on this topic. If you want to fuck around and find out how Dr. Kipp Davis is wrong still about the grammar in Galatians 1:19, then please stay tuned. What's up, heathens? How y'all doing? I'm the Godless engineer, and I critically analyze apologist claims to give you the best arguments and information so that you can stand up and use your voice. Previously, we established that Dr. Kipp Davis is actually working in the fringes of biblical scholarship. I showed that every counter-argument that Dr. Kipp employs is not based in mainstream scholarship, but rather in antiquated ideas. His first issue was separating James, the brother of the Lord, from James the pillar that appears in Galatians 2. Over 77 scholars disagree with Dr. Kipp's conclusion that the James in Galatians 1 is the same James as in Galatians 2. In part 2 of this video series, I showed how Paul's family of God theology complicates a number of statements in Paul's epistles. I also showed a number of scholars that agree about the family of God theology employed by Paul. Again, this shows that Dr. Kipp Davis is not operating in the mainstream of biblical scholarship. Rather, he is operating on the fringes of it. Now, that's not a bad thing per se, but the arguments against him are nearly insurmountable, and he barely did anything to refute that existing scholarship. Next, Kipp is going to poorly explain the grammar of Galatians 1:19. Just like with the other sections in this three-part series, Dr. Kipp gives us the section of the call-in video that offends him. And I've even had people that speak Greek like on my chat, like as their native tongue, and even in the type of Greek that the Gospels are written in, they have verified the grammar here excludes James as being an apostle. So the grammar of 1:19 specifically says that he didn't see any other apostles, or he saw Peter and none of the other apostles. And then with the exception of this other Christian named James is what that means. And how he refers to fellow Christians are brothers, sisters, brothers of the Lord. So like that's far more parsimonious to me than to specially plead for some kind of blood relation in Paul. So I covered this particular issue with the grammar of Galatians 1:19 in the first part of this video series. In short, this topic has been settled since the end of the 1970s with L. Paul Trudinger. We know this because the committee of over 100 scholars that ended up developing the NIV translation of the Bible use Trudinger's interpretation of Galatians 1:19. Combined with all the other references that we covered in part 1, this means that over 77 scholars agree with Trudinger's interpretation of Galatians 1:19. This is, of course, compounded by the fact that scholars independent of Trudinger also came to this conclusion that factored in to our 77 scholar count. If you want a more extensive explanation of how we can separate James in Galatians 1 from the James that appears in Galatians 2, I highly suggest you go back to the first video in this series. However, I do want to briefly mention L. Paul Trudinger's conclusion about Galatians 1:19 and whether or not this James, the brother of the Lord, is the same as James the pillar. Thus, construed, Paul's meaning in Galatians 1:19 is, quote, "Other than the apostles, I saw none except James, the Lord's brother," end quote. And then I also want to mention Dr. Carrier's comparative analysis analysis of Paul's linguistics, showing that for Kipp's interpretation, Paul's grammatical choices seem to make the sentence a lot more convoluted. In fact, the Greek here is quite strange, unless Paul actually meant, quote, other than the apostles, I only saw James, end quote, meaning quite specifically that this James was not an apostle. Ordinarily, to say you saw, quote, no other apostle, end quote, you would write heteron ton apostolon compared to Romans 7:23, Romans 13:9, etc. Or Eudina heteron ton apostolon, as Paul usually does, e.g. 1 Corinthians 1:14, 1 Corinthians 2:8, and 1 Corinthians 9:15, etc., or things similar. But here, Paul instead chose the unusual, and for Paul, unprecedented, construction heteron ton apostolon. Without eudois, the word heteron plus the genitive in this fashion more often means other than, rather than, another of. Paul would then be simply classifying a meeting with Cephas as a meeting with the apostles, as anticipated in 1:17, and then making sure he named all the Christians he met on that occasion, Cephas and James, in anticipation of his claim that no one in Judea had ever seen him, Galatians 1:22. The latter claim would be a lie if he had met any Christian, even one who was not an apostle, during his visit to Cephas in Galatians 1:18. So Paul has to name all the Christians he met on that occasion, and, lying or not, the number needed to be low for his argument to hold. Accordingly, Paul says there was only one other, Brother James, Richard Carrier. On the Historicity of Jesus, Why We Might Have Reason for Doubt, Kindle edition, pages 848 to 849. So my position here is not only supported by a plethora of scholarship, but also the arguments are far stronger than the one rebuttal George Howard gave in 1977, a rebuttal that failed to address the issues that were raised by Trudinger. Responding to this section, Dr. Kipp Davis has a number of issues with the way that I characterize the grammar of Galatians 1:19. Again, Paul does not refer to just any other Christians as oidelphoi to Kyrio. This expression is used exclusively of James and other members of Jesus' actual family in 1 Corinthians 9:5. Dr. Kipp continues with his presumption that this phrase, the brother or brothers of the Lord, was strictly policed to only refer to Jesus' blood relatives. And I have also pointed out how the logic of Kipp's argument here can also work in my favor if you consider the logical implications of his argument. They could have just as easily policed this phrase to only refer to Christians who had been inducted into the highest level of this cult. More than that, though, Kipp's argument totally ignores Paul's theology. As I established in the previous video, Paul's theology on God's family is inseparable from his mentions of the brothers and sisters contained in his epistles. The only way to understand Paul's references to brothers and sisters is via adoption into God's family, thus making all of them brothers and sisters of the Lord. This aspect of Paul's theology is most blatantly mentioned here. So, in Christ Jesus, you are all children of God through faith. For all of you who were baptized into Christ have clothed yourselves with Christ. There is neither Jew nor Gentile, neither slave nor free, nor is there male and female, for you are all one in Christ Jesus. If you belong to Christ, then you are Abraham's seed and heirs according to the promise. Galatians 3:26 to 29. And here, the Spirit you receive does not make you slaves, so that you live in fear again. Rather, the Spirit you received brought about your adoption to sonship. And by him we cry, Abba, Father. The Spirit himself testifies with our spirit that we are God's children. Now, if we are God's children, then we are heirs, heirs of God and co-heirs with Christ. If indeed we share in his sufferings in order that we may also share in his glory. Romans 8:15 to 17. The only way that these references make any kind of sense is through the kinship Jesus provides when you are adopted into the faith. It's amazing to me that Dr. Kipp would speak so authoritatively on a subject that he clearly knows very little about. Dr. Kipp's arguments have no evidentiary support, which is why Dr. Carrier has already handled all of these arguments in on the historicity of Jesus. Since this is just as likely, or just as unlikely, even the possibility that the phrase brother of the Lord was policed to mean only biological kin is then washed out by the equal possibility it was policed to mean only apostles of supreme rank. As either is as likely on prior considerations, neither prevails. And still more likely than both is that brothers of the Lord is simply what Christians commonly called themselves before they acquired the name Christian, an appellation Paul shows no knowledge of. The use of the complete phrase would then not be necessary other than occasionally for emphasis. Hence, Paul repeatedly speaks of Christians being simply the brethren, because everyone understood that was shorthand for brethren of the Lord. This makes brother of the Lord meant Christian the simplest hypothesis. It requires the fewest ad hoc assumptions. Furthermore, that it would mean that is actually in evidence. We know all Christians in Paul's time deemed themselves brothers of the Lord in cultic fact, whereas that it meant something else is not. Richard Carrier on the historicity of Jesus, Why We Might Have Reason for Doubt, Kindle edition, pages 842 to 843. So it seems like Dr. Kipp Davis is making an argument that's based in speculation rather than on evidence. This argument speculates about what needs to be historically true in order for the argument to work. Kind of makes it sound like begging the question at that point, doesn't it? But once you actually start to require evidence in order to make this argument, it totally crumbles. And this argument shouldn't convince anybody of Dr. Kipp's position. He seems to be foregoing the basics of logic at this point in favor of continuing to bullshit his audience and weaponize their ignorance against them. There is, however, another aspect of this argument that Kipp has taken to social media to try to highlight and encourage people to accept. He seems to think that the specific construction the brother or brothers of the Lord inherently changes the meaning of adelphos. If we go back to what he said in the last video, he claimed this. In an instance like this, when a noun in the accusative is followed by the genitive, it does not stand alone. The specific construction mentioned by Kipp doesn't actually matter to what Paul is trying to communicate. Now, this is exemplified by a lot of verses that we can bring up, and there were two that I brought up in the last video. Therefore, if what I eat causes my brother or sister to fall into sin, I will never eat meat again, so that I will not cause them to fall. 1 Corinthians 8:13. I still had no peace of mind because I did not find my brother Titus there. So I said goodbye to them and went on to Macedonia. 2 Corinthians 2:13. But there are also these verses. But I think it is necessary to send back to you Epaphroditus, my brother, co-worker, and fellow soldier, who is also your messenger, whom you sent to take care of my needs. Philippians 2:25. In addition, we are sending with them our brother, who has often proved to us in many ways that he is zealous, and now even more so because of his great confidence in you. 2 Corinthians 8:22. The Greek of these four verses follows the same patterns that Dr. Kipp has identified the brother of the Lord adhering to, meaning that each of these verses that I've mentioned contain a noun in the accusative being followed by the genitive. So in Kipp's case, these would not stand alone, and therefore should reference blood relatives. But they don't. They specifically speak about fictive kinships. So that's why Kipp's argument doesn't actually work. Another thing to note is that the construction my brother or my brothers is something that happens in translation to modern English. All four of these instances are originally in the form of brother of X, structural form, but have been shifted in translation. So if you're going to change the brother of me or the brother of us to my brother or our brother, then you should also change the brother of the Lord to the Lord's brother. That is, if you want to remain constant in your argument, which Kipp seems to have no interest in doing. Both of these representations that I've mentioned are communicating the same thing. They just can be structured differently in English. I want to emphasize that in the Greek, they are not grammatically different. And the specific construction, my brothers, technically is not possible in Greek. All right, so let's continue with Kipp's critique. Rather, Paul consistently refers to fellow Christians only as adelphoi or o adelphos. There is an important difference here that GE misses, because GE cannot read Greek, but as for his preferred reading of Galatians 1:19, he is now failing to grasp the function of the adjective heteros in the expression heteron de ton apostolon, and then followed by the conjunctive expression e me, but another of the apostles I did not see, except for James, the brother of the Lord. GE wants the exception to apply to heteros on its own, but again, this is an adjective which is connected to a genitive modifier, ton apostolon. As mentioned before, the only way the references to brothers and sisters could make sense to Paul or anyone Paul is writing to is via kinship with the Lord. Paul doesn't need to use the full title in order to understand that he's talking about brothers and sisters of the Lord. Also, I'd like you to notice how Kipp is desperately trying to make my position seem a lot more emotional than it is. He keeps saying that I want things to be true, but as I have shown, I'm just following what the scholarship says. I showed my work in the first video where I established the need for the exception interpretation. That resulted in finding over 77 biblical and New Testament scholars that agreed with that interpretation. I don't know what Kipp is talking about when he says that I just want things to be true, because that does not sound like me wanting things to be true. That's just reading what the experts say and then being convinced by those arguments. At this point, Dr. Kipp is sounding a lot like a Christian apologist who just says that atheists don't want to believe in God for one reason or another. And of course, obviously, I'm an easier target to attack than L. Paul Trudinger, or Hans-Peter Detz, or I guess Dr. Carrier in this particular instance, or any of the plethora of the over 77 scholars that we found out support my interpretation, which that just makes this entire bitch fit of a community post a straw man argument against the position. In this post or anywhere on Dr. Kipp's channel, I haven't seen him address any of the actual arguments that are advanced by the scholars like Carrier, Trudinger, Betts, or any of the other 77 scholars we found. Instead, Kipp has decided that he is going to tell everybody, well, if John just knew the Greek like I know the Greek, then he would agree with me and disagree with all of the other scholars that disagree with me. Now, I don't know if I would or wouldn't agree with Kipp if I understood Greek like Kipp did. I mean, I feel like Kipp has a poor understanding of the Greek considering all of the scholarship that I've read on this topic. But what I do know is that the logical argument that has been advanced by plenty of scholars makes coherent sense. It's logically sound. And that is what convinces me. The incoherent shit that Dr. Kipp is bringing up does not convince me whatsoever. James is part of this group, which is why the exception is required. He is not just this other Christian named James. He is James, the brother of the Lord, who is included as one of the apostles, i.e. Romans 13:1. There is no power except me, power from God. 1 Corinthians 1:14. I baptize none of you except me. I baptize Crispus and Gaius. 2 Corinthians. Of myself I shall not boast, except me. I shall boast in weakness. Richard Carrier has attempted to invoke an argument made by L. Paul Trudinger way back in 1975 to support James's exclusion from ton apostolon, but it simply does not work, which is why translators and commentators continue to treat the passage this way as opposed to his preferred reading. Other than the apostles, I saw only James. As pointed out by George Howard in his response to Trudinger, if we are to accept Carrier's translation, the full clause must be awkwardly translated to reflect the same class of persons. But other than the apostles, I did not see anyone except for the apostle James, the brother of the Lord. First in this section, Kipp doesn't inform his audience that I'm not just pulling my arguments from Carrier or Trudinger. I'm pulling my arguments from references cited by those individuals as well as a plethora of other people. Dr. Kipp's specific claim that current biblical translations are not using Trudinger's interpretation of Galatians 1:19 is simply not true. If we just go and look at the NIV Bible, they have obviously taken Trudinger's interpretation interpretation rather than Howard's. I saw none of the other apostles, only James, the Lord's brother. Galatians 1:19 NIV. Now, that version of the Bible was generated via a committee of over 100 scholars, and any changes that were made had to be approved by at least 70% of the scholars on the committee. If you don't remember, we covered this in the first video. This is how we get to at least 70 more scholars can be piled on top of the scholars that we've already mentioned. So at least more than 70 scholars had to agree that Trudinger's interpretation was more correct versus the other interpretation. Now, I'm not saying that this makes that translation objectively and absolutely true, but what I am saying is that Kipp is purposefully misrepresenting how popular this argument or this interpretation is in the scholarship. He's also misrepresenting my reasons for advancing these positions. Again, he just makes it out to be like, I want these things to be true. When in reality, as I'm showing throughout these videos, I'm just following the scholarship. I'm reading what the scholars say, I'm considering the arguments from both sides, and I'm coming to a conclusion. Is that not what we're supposed to do? Aren't we supposed to inform ourselves with actual experts in the field? If that's not the case, then how do we know which experts to listen to? Oh, that's right. We have to get prior authorization from Dr. Kipp Davis as to who to take fucking seriously. Another claim that Dr. Kipp makes is that Trudinger was actually refuted all the way back in the 70s by George Howard, but I haven't seen that at all. What we've actually seen is several independent scholars coming to the same conclusion about the interpretation of Galatians 1:19. To add on to this, I spent a good bit of time on Google Scholar trying to find any scholars out there that are referencing Howard's paper on how to interpret Galatians 1:19, and I just didn't come up with anybody. Now, that doesn't mean that they don't exist out there somewhere in the ether, but I couldn't find them. I spent like 30 minutes to an hour looking. It seems like the majority of scholars side with Trudinger and his sources. I kind of feel like Dr. Kipp is putting people in a logically awkward position. He rants and raves about adhering to fringe positions, but at the same time, he only seems to advance arguments that are in the fringes of biblical scholarship. Now, obviously, I don't have a problem with fringe positions like George Howard's. I hold on to a number of fringe positions myself. But what I do have a problem with is Dr. Kipp remaining inconsistent in his methodology. At this point, Dr. Kipp just seems like he's cherry picking which facts he wants to keep and which to throw away, but not based on any kind of good argument or evidence. Rather, he prefers facts that he personally agrees with and advances his own narrative. As for me, I analyze the arguments advanced by both sides, and I come to a conclusion based on that evidence and argumentation. It seems like Dr. Kipp is incapable of doing this. Next, Dr. Kipp has a problem with agnosticism on Paul's brother of the Lord. So here's the relevant section of the call that I took. And so he's recording who he saw there. And so this brother of the Lord, he talks about, that's just, in my view, that's just another general Christian. But I acknowledge that you can make a coherent argument that it was a blood relative due to the Greek words that are used. And it really just depends on what way Paul was using that word. But for me, all this means is that the sentence is too vague. We can't really determine for sure what Paul's talking about here and is therefore not usable for either position. To which Kipp has a problem with Galatians 1:19 being usable evidence to advance the historicist argument. As I have already pointed out, there is not really any ambiguity here. James is explicitly included as a member of the Apostles. He is not just some, quote, general Christian, end quote. And we know this because that is how the sentence is structured. This is not just, quote, a coherent argument, end quote. This is how to read the text. But that isn't a coherent argument, just like I've established in this 3-part video response to his community post. All Kipp seems to be doing is just bullshitting us about the Greek that Paul used. Dr. Kipp doesn't seem to really understand the ramification of Paul's theology when it's concerned with the brother of the Lord. He doesn't seem to understand this family of God theology that Paul has. has. You simply cannot make a coherent argument if you're going to atomize Paul's theology to where you can abstract out his statements so that they stand alone rather than include the full breadth of Paul's theology. That sounds like a disingenuous tactic that apologists would use. Remember, we've already called him once before sounding like a Christian apologist when he claims that I just want facts to be true. Quite to the contrary, GE's reading is strained. If Paul wanted to say that he only saw Peter and James and no one else, he could have written this much more clearly, like...
Ανήλθον εις Ιεροσόλυμα ιστορής εκειφάν των Απόστολων και επέμεινα προς αυτόν ημέρας 15, Άιον δε ουκ είδον ημί Ιάκωβον των αδελφών του Κυρίου.
I went up to Jerusalem to get to know Cephas the apostle, and I stayed with him 15 days, but I did not see anyone else except James, the brother of the Lord. Carrier also suggests alternative ways that Paul could have made more clear James's distinction as an apostle, but I think the point here rather shows the complexity of James's position in the Jerusalem church. Yes, James is among the apostles. He is one of the pillars, but he is more significantly the brother of the Lord. No, we know pretty clearly what Paul is talking about because of how the sentence is structured, and because he uses a different ton adelphon to Kyrio, only of James, and in one other place of other brothers of Jesus. At this point, I feel like everybody should go back in time in this very video to near the beginning where we covered the comparative analysis that Dr. Carrier does on Paul's linguistics. And he comes up with other versions of these Greek phrases that could have been constructed by Paul that would have made it more clear using other constructions that Paul already uses. In fact, the Greek here is quite strange, unless Paul actually meant, quote, other than the apostles I only saw James, end quote, meaning quite specifically that this James was not an apostle. Ordinarily, to say you saw, quote, no other apostle, end quote, you would write heteron ton apostolon compared to Romans 7:23, Romans 13:9, etc. Or Eudina heteron ton apostolon, as Paul usually does, e.g. 1 Corinthians 1:14, 1 Corinthians 2:8, and 1 Corinthians 9:15, etc., or things similar. But here, Paul instead chose the unusual, and for Paul, unprecedented, construction heteron ton apostolon. Without eudois, the word heteron plus the genitive in this fashion more often means other than, rather than, another of. Paul would then be simply classifying a meeting with Cephas as a meeting with the apostles, as anticipated in 1:17, and then making sure he named all the Christians he met on that occasion, Cephas and James, in anticipation of his claim that no one in Judea had ever seen him, Galatians 1:22. The latter claim would be a lie if he had met any Christian, even one who was not an apostle, during his visit to Cephas in Galatians 1:18. So Paul has to name all the Christians he met on that occasion, and, lying or not, the number needed to be low for his argument to hold. Accordingly, Paul says there was only one other, Brother James, Richard Carrier, on the Historicity of Jesus, Why We Might Have Reason for Doubt, Kindle edition, pages 848 to 849. Now compare that to the shit that Kipp just did. Kipp doesn't do any kind of comparative analysis. He doesn't tell us where Paul uses phrases like this in the rest of his epistles. He doesn't come up with reasonable alternative ways in order to construct the sentence. He just constructs a sentence that makes sense to him, rather than a sentence that would make sense to Paul. I feel like this is a major folly if you're claiming to be an expert in this area. And also, I think that it's perfectly fine that Kipp finds the interpretation advanced by well over 70 biblical and New Testament scholars, as well as Trudinger, Betts, Carrier, and all of their sources. It's fine that he thinks that that reading is strained. What he needs to do now is to take that up with those scholars, address their actual arguments, instead of addressing me like it's my argument and saying shit that I want to be true. The fact that he won't address the over 77 scholars that advance this particular interpretation rather than an amateur YouTuber makes Kipp look pathetic. If they are wrong, prove that they are wrong. Kipp is not proving anybody wrong by disagreeing with me. Honestly, I feel like we're all adults in this conversation, and that shouldn't have to be said, but at this point, it's painfully obvious that it does. Ultimately, Kipp disagrees with a large majority of mainstream scholarship on this particular interpretation. Instead, he decides to lean away from mainstream scholarship and lean more towards traditionalists that are motivated by theology rather than evidence. It's totally fine if he wants to do that, but he needs to stop acting like the mythicist position isn't informed by mainstream scholarship. Like I said at the beginning of this video, I can't read Greek, but what I can read are the scholars who write and discuss how the Greek is structured grammatically. He can't read Greek, so he is wrong. It's only an argument that might be convincing if I was making a novel argument analyzing the Greek. I'm not doing this, and I never have. All I'm doing is summarizing the expert position on this topic. Dr. Kipp, focusing on me rather than the scholarship, just tells me that he either can't refute the actual arguments or he's too afraid to disagree with those scholars. If Kipp were honest in his posts and he said, I know a majority of scholars disagree with me on this, but I am right for these reasons, his posts wouldn't actually have the kind of impact that he hoped it to have. GE really needs to stop making these arguments from a language that he clearly does not understand. But I am not holding my breath. I mean, how much can he be blamed for pretending to know the Greek literature when his mentor, Richard Carrier, likewise pretends to understand the Hebrew and Aramaic sources of early Judaism? Now, that particular claim right there at the end, it's either Dr. Kipp is lying about that or he's just ignorant about the plethora of scholarship that Richard Carrier has in OHJ, the plethora of online responses that we've done directly to Dr. Kipp on this particular topic. Carrier has never claimed to be an expert in Hebrew or Aramaic. In fact, in OHJ and any of the streams that we've done here or any of the streams or content that Carrier has produced elsewhere, he has never claimed to be an expert in Hebrew or Aramaic. In fact, he's only said that he's summarizing the expert positions. You would think that Kipp would know this considering the amount of content he claims to have watched. Of course, in order for Kipp to stick with his tactic, it makes sense that he would misrepresent Carrier's expertise. Honestly, I find no value in straw man arguments. It just makes you look like a dick when you do it. I do my best to steel man my opponent's positions. It seems like that particular quality isn't exactly favored by Kipp. Now, as far as I go, I am making an argument based on the scholarship of experts that do know the Greek language. Also, notice at the end when he starts to shit talk Carrier, he's no longer talking about being a Greek expert, because Carrier does know Greek and he is an expert in this particular area, and so Kipp has to shift to Hebrew and Aramaic. All of this is just a really sad and pathetic tactic for Dr. Kipp to take. I would really love for him to honestly engage with the arguments. I would love for him to get on a stream with Dr. Carrier or anybody else that disagrees with him on the Greek grammar here. I mean, we've found over 77 scholars. Surely there's one out there that he doesn't have a personal problem with. Of course, I've seen all your comments that have asked for Kipp to directly address Carrier on a stream, which I would love to set up, but Kipp has steadfastly disagreed with appearing on a stream and directly addressing Carrier. All in all, for this community post, I can see how his lackeys would be totally convinced by the arguments that he puts forth. Dr. Kipp speaks with an air of expertise in this area, but what I find in his argumentation is really amateurish, and that's coming from an amateur. I agree, I am an amateur, but I'm an amateur that bases his arguments in the scholarship. So they're not really my arguments for anything. I'm just summarizing what the experts say on these topics. I think Kipp needs to start actually doing his job of being a scholar, because this is not scholarly level work. I appreciate all you heathens for sticking with me through all 3 of these videos. If you will, please go down below, let me know what you thought about this community post. I'd love to hear what you guys think. Do you think that Kipp made solid arguments, or do you think that I'm missing something here? Let me know down below in the comments. And while you're down there, why don't you smash that like button and subscribe if you like this kind of content. Don't forget to stand up and use your voice. Bye, heathens.